Sayadaw in Rangoon in year 1979. He trained under Sayados U Pantika, U Tisara, U Achina, and U Tijaniya. Besides practicing meditations, he studied at once Pali grammar under Sayadaw U Dhammananda at Wat Tamau, Thailand, and the Pali Tipitaka in Myanmar, researching on its interpretations and practice until his return to Malaysia at the end of 1994. After a 4-year solitary meditation retreat in Sarawak, he returned to West Malaysia in 1998, and since then has been investigating popular interpretations and practices of Buddhism in the light of the Bali scripture, real-life experiences, and contemporary research findings. Using a critical yet constructive approach, he shares his findings with others to bring them closer to practical reality via his writing, sutta study with meditation workshops, meditation retreats, and mindful hiking retreats. He is dedicated to teaching the full spectrum of mindfulness, of which present moment awareness constitutes only one aspect. His teaching, which have been described by his students as structured and easily understood, are always oriented towards practical application in daily life. In year 2000, he founded Sasanalaka Buddhist Sanctuary in Taipei. In year 2012, Ayasma Aggacitta was invited by TPCM to be one of the founding members of its monastic advisory panel. Brother and sister, without further ado, may we put our palm together to invite and welcome Ayasma Aggacitta to start his talk today. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Hello everybody.
Hi, Bhante.
I must first of all express my gratitude to Sudhamma Buddhist Society for inviting me to participate in this Zoom event, because at first I thought that where I'm staying in an Ulu place, I would not be able to connect to Zoom. But then with Brother Lee and Sharon's encouragement, we somehow managed to rig it up. And so I'm very happy that I'm able to reach out to everybody here who are participating in this event today. The title of today's talk is Watch Your Mind Now. I think it's a very interesting talk. It was suggested by the members of Sudhamma Buddhist Society itself, and it's really my cup of tea, because for the past 15 years or so, I have been trying to encourage people to practice mindfulness in daily life, and particularly to watch the mind rather than the objects. I think you all know that most meditation techniques available these days focus on watching the objects of the senses, watching your breath, watching your rising and falling, watching your movements, and so forth, mostly focusing on the objects of the senses. But I have been trying to shift the focus to watching the subject rather than the objects. The subject is the one that is experiencing all these things that is happening outside. Not only the five senses, but the mind itself. So I was very happy that they picked this topic, because it is very close to my heart. And I've been teaching this for the past 15 years or so. Why is it important for us to watch the mind, especially right now in such trying circumstances? In the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we're just coming out of the MCO, so it's not that bad. But when most countries have enforced this restriction on people from going out, then we're all forced to stay together in our own family, in our own household. Although it's good to have family cohesion, it's good for the family to come together, it's a good time, for parents to be with their children. Otherwise, they'll be very busy making a living and having little time with the children and members of the family. But there are also a downside to it. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the English saying, familiarity breeds contempt, right? And absence makes the heart grow fonder. So when you are confined to your small apartment or your little house, particularly if you live in an apartment, up in a high rise in a condo, you know, your space of movement is very restricted and you have to see the same people day in and day out and they get on your nerves, right? So that's one of those things that bother a lot of people when they are confined in these small places, restricted to just such confined places. I saw a short clip from BBC which talks about one guy in Italy who was saying that if this restriction continues to go on, I'm locked in my little apartment. If I can't go outside, I'm going to go crazy soon. For people who are not used to meditation, who have not done any sort of meditation before, that is something not to look forward to, something which is difficult to cope with. But for people who have done retreats before, who are particularly good at meditating, they find that this is a wonderful opportunity for them to practice mindfulness in daily life, within the home, time for them to go on a perennial retreat, so to speak. But like everybody knows, after a very heavy schedule in your daily life, and then you plan for a long-awaited holiday vacation, you're very excited and very happy when you set out on a vacation. After a few days, you begin to feel bored. So because the mind is so used to getting busy with lots of things, so you get bored after some time when the novelty wears out. In the same way, at first you may rejoice that you have this MCO, this restriction of movements, you're just confined to a place and it's time for you to do your own personal retreat. But after some time, people get bored. Yeah, it's just the nature of the mind. So the importance of watching your mind is for you not to get caught up in all these thoughts, these reactions that goes on automatically in most people. Not only are you confronted with these problems of relationship with your family, but there are also thoughts about concerns about the future. As you all know, there's going to be a global recession very soon, if not already happening now. And many airlines in the world are closing shop because no business, no travelers. So the economy is going to suffer a great deal, and some people might become unemployed, and unemployment is on the rise. So these are things that also bother people in these trying times. So if you allow your mind to get caught up in such thoughts without having any constructive answers to them, solutions to them, then you are causing unnecessary suffering to yourself. Another concern is fear of contagion, because the disease is so easily transmitted. And you have to exercise utmost mindfulness and perseverance and persistence in order to follow all those guidelines issued by the authorities with respect to social distancing, with respect to the sanitation of your hands, the things that you come into contact with. So it's very easy to forget about that and to accidentally touch something, and then that could actually bring about a contagion within your family. So all these things also require mindfulness. During the start of this COVID pandemic, when it first came to Malaysia, I also had a duration where I felt unwell, there was this persistent fever going on, but it was not high fever. When I read about all these guidelines, I tried to follow it for one day, but it was so tedious. Every doorknob that you close and open has to be sanitized. You have to wash your hands every time. And if you want to wash your hands, you have to use the sanitizer, and that dries your skin. Oh, wow, it's so tedious. And luckily, I'm staying alone. And luckily, nobody around my area got infected. So we don't really have to follow these guidelines that strictly. However, if you're staying in some places like in KL, some hot areas, some red areas, red spots, and especially when you go to public places, then you have to be really very careful. And so that requires a lot of mindfulness. Mindfulness is not just about being in the present moment. Mindfulness is the quality of reminding yourself. Yeah. Not to unnecessarily touch doorknobs, to keep away from touching your face. Like in Singapore, they say that your face is sacred. Don't touch your face, because that's an opportunity for the virus to come into contact with your mucous membrane somewhere, with the mucus, and then it will flow into your lungs. Right, so these are the concerns that we have, concerns about relationships when we are confined, when you're restricted to a confined place, number one. Number two, also concerns about the economy of the future. If you're a student, also concerned about your studies, how about your exams and so forth. And thirdly, we also have a lot of concerns about this pandemic, contagion, and the impact you will have also on Buddhist centers, where people cannot go physically to your premises. And because Buddhist centers depend on donations when people come to their centers, now this is something like a vacuum. So where are you going to get your funds to continue to run your society, to pay a rent if you're renting a space somewhere for your Buddhist society's premises? So no doubt, we have to do something. We have to learn to manage the mind, not to be overly concerned or get carried away and proliferate on some of these problems and issues which we cannot solve. So if you find that you cannot solve those issues, then leave them aside first and do something more useful. Okay, so now we know how important it is. So that's why we need to watch the mind. Yeah, we need to watch the mind so that we'll be able to sieve those important things, and then the unimportant things that we cannot solve, then we have to leave aside. Part of the title is also the importance, the efficacy, and the how of watching the mind. So the importance of watching the mind, first of all, is that when you watch your mind, you understand your thoughts and emotions more, rather than becoming a slave of your past conditioning, of reacting automatically, or spontaneously, irrationally, or impetuously to some trigger that somebody has pulled, or some button that somebody has pushed. So when you understand your thoughts and emotions more, then you will be able to reprogram your mindset through direct personal experience. Now we will talk more about this later. I'm just giving you the main points. And once you're able to do that, once you're able to understand your thoughts and emotions, and you're able to reprogram your mindset through direct personal experience, it's not something theoretical. It's something that you really experience yourself. You see the profundity of it. It's a sort of a realization. And then you become more accepting and forgiving of yourself and others. When you see yourself, when you watch your mind, you see how your thoughts and emotions come and go, how all your thoughts, your ideas are the products of numerous causes and conditions. Then you begin to sympathize and empathize with people. You know, we are all in the same boat. And then when you can do that, then it's easier to let go, and therefore be more contented and happy. Okay, so that's how it becomes efficacious. When you watch your mind, you understand yourself, then you can also understand others. Yeah, so this is the importance and efficacy of watching the mind, but then how do you go about watching the mind? You see, it's easy to say, watch your mind, watch your mind. But most people, when they try to watch their mind, what happens is they get caught up in their own thoughts and emotions. So it's not so easy to watch the mind if you don't have a foundation in anchoring the mind elsewhere so that it doesn't get caught up in unnecessary thinking, imagination, proliferation, and so forth. Now, in order to understand how to do so, it's good for us to also understand theoretically some fundamentals about how the mind works. So I'm going to talk about what I usually call the 561 feature of the senses. Right? 561. Well, this one doesn't have 4 digits, so you can't, no unpad echo for you to go and buy afterwards. It's only 3 digits, 561. And the 5 here refers to the 5 senses. As you all know, our 5 senses can only take objects in the present moment. Not only that, each sense is very specific. The eye can only cognize or be aware of visual objects. The ears can only hear sounds. The nose can only smell smells. It cannot see, it cannot hear. The tongue can only taste tastes, and it cannot do any of the other functions of the other senses. And the body can only sense physical sensations. And the body cannot smell, cannot taste, cannot hear, cannot see. So they are very specific, and each of their specific object must also be in the present moment. The eyes can only see something if the eyes are open, the eyes are in good order, the eyes are open, there's light, and there's an object. If any of these conditions are not there, then the eye won't function, can't see anything. And they must be in the present moment. You see, right now you're watching the video, right? If the host decides to kick you out of the room, then you can't see anything, right? Because the conditions are not there. You saw something last night, perhaps you saw a video, YouTube video or documentary somewhere. But if you are not watching it right now, it's not on a screen right now, you won't be able to see it with your eyes. You ate something last night, some very delicious food. Yeah, but now if it's not in your mouth, your tongue also cannot taste the food. Right? So it's very obvious that all of the 5 senses can only take objects right here, right now. Number 6 here refers to the 6th sense, and that's the mind. The mind is different from the 5 senses. It's very special because it can take objects of the past, present, future, and beyond. Although your eyes cannot see the video you saw last night, although your tongue cannot taste the food that you ate earlier on this morning for breakfast, your mind can recall that experience that's past. The mind can also be aware of present objects, even without the senses. Now, with our senses in good order, with our 5 senses operating simultaneously, the mind actually doesn't really see objects in the present. The eye sees first, and then the mind tries to interpret what the eyes have seen. The eyes only see colors, and the mind will interpret what color it is. I'll give you one good example. A couple of years ago, I was having a retreat up in Mitraville in Kundasan, up in Sabah. It was pretty high, maybe 1,000 meters high. And at that time, early in the morning, we had this guided open awareness practice. I call it Panoramic Awareness because all the yogis were outside, sitting facing the hills. And it was about dawn, between dawn to sunrise. So they were facing, they were all sitting or standing at the corridor, at the balcony, facing the very scenic landscape, panoramic view in front of them. So when we practice panoramic awareness, we just put the attention of the eye in space, defocus it, and just be aware of seeing as well as whatever is happening to the senses. So at that time, there were mists covering the mountaintops, covering the valleys below. It was a beautiful sight. And then the colors were changing because it's dawn, and it's changing from a little brightness in the sky to various shades of orange and yellow, being in the clouds, looking at all this scenic thing like a Shangri-La. It's supposed to be very beautiful, isn't it? So I asked the yogis, now look carefully, watch your mind. When you're admiring this panoramic beauty, is the beauty being appreciated by the eyes or by your mind? So I just left it to them, and later on during the interview, I asked them, so is the English saying correct? Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder? It's not. Beauty does not lie in the eyes of the beholder. Beauty lies in the mind of the beholder. Because what the eye sees are just colors. The eyes cannot differentiate between mists and hills and different shades of orange and yellow and white and blue. No. The beauty of all these things, the sense of beauty actually arises in the mind itself. And this sense of beauty also is probably conditioned by past experiences, by past ideas of how things should be. The mind is not actually aware of the present, not the real present. This is an immediate past. The eye sees all these various colors first, and then the mind will piece all these different acts of seeing together and make an idea out of it. Create the concept of beauty and evoke the sense of pleasure or well-being. So what sort of present objects does the mind really recognize? Now, if the five senses are all shut down and the mind can still see, hear, and smell, then that should be in the present. And when does this happen? I'm sure many of you have heard of out-of-the-body experiences. Especially now, millions of people have gone through that because of the advance in our technology. Now, people who die of heart disease or heart attack or are hurt seriously in an accident are taken to the hospital, to the emergency room, to the ICU, to the operating room, and then the emergency physicians will try to resuscitate their body, even though the heart has stopped beating, and in some cases, even though brain is no longer functioning. So this may happen for quite a while. Sometimes it's just a few minutes, sometimes it's a few hours, and in some bizarre cases, even a few days. I know of one very bizarre case. I think it's a Russian. He was put in the mortuary for a few days before he revived, and then he told the story of what happened during that time when he's supposed to be dead. Okay, so what happens when these people describe their out-of-body experience, so-called out-of-body. Because at that time, they are supposed to be dead. The senses are no longer functioning. All the instruments that are rigged to the body, to the brain, are all registered. It's all zero. But then when they come back after the experience, when they are resuscitated, they say that at that time, they were fully conscious of what's happening. Some people say that they were up on the ceiling, looking down and what the surgeons are trying to do, or frantically trying to revive the patient. And the patient can also describe in detail all the processes and the instruments that the surgeons, the emergency physicians were using. This baffled the emergency team because there's no scientific explanation for that. A layman would not be able to know those complicated procedures that were going on. And not only that, there was one particular case of one woman. One surgeon was trying to save this woman, and in the course of the operation, suddenly the ECG machine went beep, 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 beep. It was straight line, nothing left. No more heartbeat, no more breathing. And so the doctor, in exasperation, exclaimed, or the cursed, "I lost you, you bitch." He said that. But then later, somehow, they managed to revive that lady. And when she came out of it, she told them what happened. And she told the surgeon, "I heard what you said." You see, so all these things are happening, even though the five senses are shut down. The mind can still perceive things happening in the present moment. Well, there are some people who have clairvoyance. It's a natural gift. They can know what's going to happen in the future. And of course, you don't see the future with your eyes. You see it with the mind's eye. An event that's going to happen somewhere, and they know about it. And when the time comes, then the event actually happens. So this is natural predisposition of some people. It's a natural gift. Or some people say it's a curse, because sometimes they know that something bad is going to happen to somebody, and yet they can't do anything about it. And they can't even tell that person. So some people say, I'd rather not have that gift because it's so difficult and so frustrating, and sometimes so sad. Okay, so that's past, present, and future. The mind, the sixth sense, is really very special. It's not limited to the present, but it can take objects of the past, present, future, and beyond what the five senses can comprehend. For example, the mind can experience Nibbana and other worlds and other dimensions. I remember one story of one artist who was an atheist, or rather, he was a non-believer. He doesn't believe in anything. And then he had this near-death experience. And after he went through that whole experience, he came back and became a pastor. He was an artist. So he described his experience when he was in this realm. He says, the colors were just unimaginable. There's no way that you can imagine those colors. There's no way that you can reproduce those colors with our pigments and whatever paints that we have right now. And it's indescribable. Of course, because we can only describe things according to what our senses perceive. But that's beyond the five senses. Also, some people, when they go up there, they hear certain sounds and musics and vibrations. They also say it cannot be described. There's no way that the vocabulary of the five senses can describe something which they experience through the mind, not through the five senses. Now we go on to one. So one here refers to the object that the mind can take. We saw that the five senses can only take objects in the present and must be very specific to the sense. Whereas the mind can take objects of the past, present, future, and beyond. But even though the mind can be so fantastic, so special, for normal people, the mind can only take one object at a time. I have a qualifier there for normal people because they are very highly attained Indian yogis who say that when they reach a certain stage, they can experience things simultaneously. And there are also accounts of people who witness this particular yogi appearing in different places at the same time. So that is super normal people. So we're talking about normal people who are not that great yogis. So normally the mind can only take one object at a time. And I'm sure many of you might protest and say, how can that be true? I can multitask. Right now, I'm not only hearing what you say, not only understanding what you say, but I'm also looking at you in the video. I'm also sensing my body. I'm smelling things. So it seems that everything is happening simultaneously. Correct. Everything is happening simultaneously, but the mind can only know one object at a time. The body, for example, you know the senses in the body, the receptors in the body, in the trillions. You can only experience very gross sensations that are predominant. While you're listening to me, you cannot experience what's happening in your stomach or in various parts of the internal organs. But the body knows, and the body has its own intelligence, and the body is operating by itself, making sure that things are going smoothly and all the organs are functioning smoothly. It's doing so, but the mind doesn't know. The mind doesn't know a single thing. Neuroscientists have also proven that multitasking is actually, multitasking works, but the mind doesn't actually multitask. The mind works so fast that you think you're multitasking. So what they did was they wired the brains of their subjects, and then they put them to some multitasking job. And then they monitor what's going on in their brain. And they found that when a person is doing different types of activities in a multitasking job, one part of the brain will be stimulated for each activity. But it happens so fast, you think that it's happening simultaneously. Now, I'm not saying that mind equals brain. Although most neuroscientists nowadays believe so. They believe that the mind is the brain. But I would say that there is a correlation with neural activity and mental activity. Not necessarily that the mind must be the brain, but there is a correlation between one and the other. And the mind is the precursor, followed by neural activity. Okay, so when we know this 561 feature of the senses, how can that help us to watch the mind? Well, for most people, the mind is all over the place, thinking of this and that. If you're a student or if you are an employee and you are supposed to focus on a particular task, and then you will know sometimes when you cannot focus because the mind is distracted by many things, many other concerns. Perhaps if we had an argument or a quarrel with somebody, a friend or a close one, you are not satisfied with that, you are dissatisfied, you have a lot of anger or the resentment, and you try to do a work, you try to study, you try to execute a particular task, you find that your mind keeps on running off, going back to that incident to replay all the unpleasant sensations, as though the mind is very sadistic. You know, it's unpleasant already, why you want to think about it? But it's the nature of the mind. The mind just loves to suffer by thinking about all those unpleasant things. Okay, so you see that most of our sufferings, our mental sufferings, occurs in the mind. Granted, there are physical sufferings, of course. due to external factors like your diet, your environment, your lifestyle, stress, and all these sort of things, physical stress, that can also bring about suffering. That is on the physical level. Scientists have found out that even though our world now is so advanced technologically, so many conveniences and comforts in life. You have now artificial intelligence, robots can do everything for you. Things are so easy. You can just wash your dishes by pressing a button. You cook your food by just switching on the gas. It's so simple. And yet, one of the major diseases that are rising in the world right now is connected with the mind. The depression. Depression is overtaking heart disease and some of these other degenerative diseases. So a lot of suffering is happening in the mind. So it's about time then that we begin to watch the mind and manage all these things so that we don't become slaves of our past conditioning and suffer through our own proliferations. So by knowing this 5-6-1 principle, since the mind is a culprit, the mind is a culprit that is creating all these imaginings, all these concerns, all these fears, all these proliferations to make us suffer, then we need to do something so that it doesn't end up that way. Right, since the mind can only take one object at a time, what if we tie the mind to just the 5 senses? Now, since the 5 senses can only be aware or be conscious of objects in the present moment, if you tie the mind to be aware of the 5 senses, then the mind is as close to the present as it can be. It's not in the real present, but right immediately behind the real present, because the 5 senses are conscious of present objects. And if the mind is aware of the objects of the 5 senses, that means it's right behind the present. So when the mind is tied in that sort of situation, since the mind can only take one object at a time, then it doesn't have the time to go and think of other things, especially all those resentment, jealousy, anger, and so forth. No time, because it's busy with the so-called present, the immediate past. So that brings me to how to compose the mind. Now I have this formula which I created. It's called Ada Anchor. Some of you who have already attended my retreats before would know very well what I mean. I also do that. I also teach that during guided meditation in my Sutta study with meditation workshops. A stands for accept the fact that whatever happens is a product of causes and conditions. Whatever happens in the mind, and also whatever happens to the senses. These are products of causes and conditions, and even though you might not be able to understand or see experientially the causes and conditions that brought about these sensory experiences or mental experiences, accept it first on faith. And particularly when it comes to the mind, whatever happens in the mind, don't reject, don't follow, or ignore. Which means to say, if it's an unpleasant thought, an unpleasant emotion, a displeasure in your mind, resentment, jealousy, judgment, or so forth, don't reject it. But if it's something nice and pleasant, like a pleasant memory, nice pleasures, don't follow it. And thirdly, if it's neither pleasant nor unpleasant, it's something very neutral, also don't ignore it. Right? So the first one is to accept. The second step is don't reject, follow or ignore. Next one is to acknowledge it. Now, if you don't ignore it, what do? If you don't ignore it, then you acknowledge it. If it's an unpleasant thought, a resentment, a judgment, a comment, a nasty comment on somebody or on yourself, then acknowledge it. Don't follow it. Don't react to it. Don't follow it if something pleasant, and don't ignore it if it's something neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but acknowledge it, and then you come back to your five senses. You anchor the mind to the five senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting. Now, this is particularly very useful because most people think of composure as an attainment that can only happen when you are seated, cross-legged, with your eyes closed, and watching your breath or watching your rising and falling or doing something like that. But when you're talking about anchoring the mind to the five senses, this can happen anytime, anywhere. As long as you are awake, the senses are operating, you can always bring your mind to be aware of the present moment of what's happening to the senses. Like right now, for example, you are watching this video. While you are looking at the screen and while you're trying to understand what I say, you can also be aware of your body in the background. Sensations in your body, the sense of being seated. You can also see what's happening to your mind. But that's another step. We're talking about the body first, the five senses. So when you're able to do this is what I call open awareness, because you open up your awareness to the senses. And this will give you dynamic serenity, in the sense that because your mind has been trained to stay with the senses, with whatever you're doing, when you're walking, or you're washing the dishes, when you're sweeping the house, when you're cooking, you can be aware of what's happening in your senses. You're looking vegetables, your hand is holding the vegetable, one hand is holding the vegetable, the other hand is holding the knife, and you're cutting it. You can hear the sound of the chopping board. Now you can feel sensations in your hand, and you can see also, you can get a sense of smell, especially when you're cutting onions or chilies or something like that. Be aware of all these things. These are happening to the five senses. So when you are glued to the five senses in that way, to present activities of the five senses, then your mind will not have a chance to go and think of the past or worry about the future. Usually people like to ruminate, replay things that have just happened, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. And of course, people like to plan for the future. Right? So by trying to tie your mind to be aware of the five senses, you cut down all these extraneous mental activities. But I'm not saying that you should completely stop thinking. That's impossible, because you are living in this world. You need to think, but think productive thoughts. Unproductive thoughts, idle thoughts, don't entertain them. Put them aside, come back to the present moment to be aware of what's happening to your senses. So you might wonder, what is composure? Now, composure is my translation for samadhi. I have another translation which I coined when I was doing the Satipatthana Sutta study with meditation workshop. I call it compo focus. It's a combination of composure and focus. But I'm not going into detail of that. Basically, composure is my translation for samadhi. Samadhi is usually translated as concentration, but you see that the word concentration and composure has different connotations, right? Actually, the word samadhi is sam, and di. Sang here means properly bring and place the mind. Right? Properly bring and place the mind. Sang is properly, is to bring, and di, place the mind, without being distracted by thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. Usually people are distracted by thoughts, feelings, and perception. So if you're able to tie your mind to what's happening with the senses in the present moment, then you achieve composure because the mind is not distracted by thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. There might still be thoughts, feelings, and perceptions coming and going, but you're not distracted by them. You are with the present moment. So I thought we were supposed to watch the mind. So why are we talking about composure now? Well, when you have composure, it gives you the space. It gives you the space to process what's going on in the mind. What do I mean by space? You see, if you allow your mind to run all over the place, pulled by this thought, pulled by that imagination, pulled by that concern, by that emotion, it's all over the place, everywhere, distracted, then there's no space for you. One thought after another is linked. It is so closely connected that there's no space in between one thought and another. It's just a train of thoughts, or maybe not even be a train, it's like a highway of thoughts. A train of thought, a train is just one train, going on a track. But if it's a highway, you got all sorts of cars going everywhere. So it is like a highway of thoughts, emotions, and perceptions and feelings, all happening everywhere. Your mind becomes totally distracted. But however, when you train the mind to stay with present activities of the five senses, then once in a while, a thought will come, a feeling will come, perception will come and go. Because you have trained the mind not to be pulled by them, they come and they go. But then there's a space in between your awareness of what's happening in the five senses and what's happening in the mind. Okay, so what happens is that when there is this space, there's this space between one thought and another, one thought and a perception or a feeling, then it gives you the chance to process whether you want to follow that thought or not. I said earlier, I'm not asking you to stop thinking altogether. It's impossible, but you need to be selective. So when you have this space between one thought and another, then you have this chance to be selective, to process. So how do we process the mind? When you have this space in between, then you can check whether your thoughts, feelings, and perceptions accord with the bar test. Whether they are in line with the bar test. BARR. The first one, B, stands for beneficial. The next one stands for appropriate. A stands for appropriate. R stands for relevant. Or the last R stands for realistic. Let me explain each of them. Beneficial here, from the Buddhist point of view, refers to something which is not harmful. That's a very basic Buddhist principle of Buddhist ethics. It's not harmful and it results in the well-being for yourself and for others. Well, harmful need not necessarily be confined to ethical conduct. It can also apply to your state of well-being. For example, you like to eat something, but you know that it's not good for your body. And yet, because of greed, you go and eat it anyway. So that's not beneficial. So you process your thought, your intention that arises in your mind, and you see whether it is beneficial, appropriate, relevant, or realistic. Only if it is, then you go ahead and follow it. Otherwise, if it's not beneficial, just leave it, come back to what you're doing, the five senses. The next one is appropriate. Appropriate here refers to quite a number of things. Appropriate in relation to circumstances, For example, whether it's the right person, if you have a thought that arises in you, you want to say something, then whether it's the right person to say, to talk to, whether it's the right time, whether it's the right place, and then the mood of the person and your own mood and the way you want to express it. So this is quite encompassing. A lot of times things might be beneficial, but then if you say it at the wrong time, it might turn out to be harmful. So beneficial, appropriate, and the next one is relevant. Relevant here refers to whether it is your duty to do so, whether it's your responsibility, and whether there's perseverance in doing whatever you're doing. For example, you want to achieve a target, and let's say that target is beneficial, it's not harmful to yourself, to others, it results in the well-being for yourself and others. But there may be obstacles along the way, and you are daunted by these obstacles and you want to give up. Okay, so there's no perseverance. If you persevere despite all these obstacles, then in that there's one aspect of relevance, because it is relevant to the target that you want to reach. Right? So if it is not your job, not your responsibility, even though it might be beneficial and it might be appropriate, but if it's not relevant to you, not your job, not your responsibility, then you shouldn't follow it. Bo su mai chui su. Yeah, mai ki chap su. If it doesn't apply to you, then better leave it aside. Else you might offend some people for overstepping your limits. The last one, realistic here, can be seen from two aspects. One is whether it's factual, and secondly, whether it's practical, feasible, or doable. Factual is in a sense like it's a fact, not just an assumption, not just hearsay, not just rumors. Now, if you are a leader, if a leader of some sort, not necessarily the leader of a whole organization, maybe a group leader of your particular department, there will be bound to be people who will come to complain to you about other people's behavior or misconduct. As you all know, it takes two hands to clap. Don't just listen to one part of the story and arrive at a judgment. Make sure that you listen to both parts, to both sides of the story, and then you decide. Right? So whatever that first person tells you is only his perception of things. It may not necessarily be factual. Let's not talk about people complaining to you, even your own suspicions about somebody. And this is very common. It happens particularly among spouses, among partners, people who are close to one another. They suspect that the other person is not living up to mutual expectations of how one should behave. No evidence, just suspicion. That is not a fact. That is an assumption. It's a suspicion. So if it's not evidence-based, then don't simply confront that person and berate that person or scold that person or whatever, that's really looking for trouble. The second part of realistic is whether it's practical, feasible, or doable. Like in Sudhamma Buddhist Society, it's in the middle of the town or it's a fringe of the town, and then you're thinking of creating a retreat center, something like SPS. That's a fantastic idea. But is it realistic? Can you get it? Can you do it somewhere in Seremban itself? Right? Even though you can get a piece of land somewhere, whether it will be approved by the government, and whether it's within your budget, and so forth. You have to consider all these things before you pursue that intention or that thought or that plan. So whether it's practical, doable, or feasible. You can actually do this step by step. If something is beneficial, then you go on to what is appropriate. You find out and see whether it's appropriate. Well, if it's beneficial and appropriate, then you go on to the next one to see whether it is relevant, right? And then if it is relevant, then you go on to realistic. Okay, so it can be a step-by-step process, one after another. Now, you might think that, wow, this one is so tedious. You said that there can be a space in between. Where you got enough space to do so much analyzing? Beneficial, appropriate, relevant, realistic. Usually, most of the times, it doesn't pass step number 1. So you don't have to worry about the other ARR. So once it doesn't pass the beneficial, you just trash it, finish, then you come back to what you're doing. So it is very simple. Yeah, you don't have to go through the whole process. Just the first step and it's already out. One time I was conducting a mindful hiking retreat in, where was I? Cameron Highlands. Yeah, and one of the participants, during our sharing sessions, he says, it's so nice to do this because the mind is simply blank, because whatever thought, whatever intention that arises, 99% is all not beneficial. So I don't have to think, I just put it aside and just be on the present. Yeah. Okay, now let's talk about well-spoken speech, the other set of guidelines that was given by the Buddha. There's some overlap between the BARR and this one. I've created an acronym for this, and it's called Bet and Tip Me. Now, bet means like you make a bet in a horse racing contest. Tip is like you tip a waiter, and me means myself, right? Bet and tip me. It doesn't make sense, but it's catchy enough for you to remember. So what does this mean? These refer to the set of 5 factors that the Buddha talks about in Anguttara Nikaya, Book of Fives. It's called Vaca Sutta. Anguttara Nikaya, Book of Fives, Sutta number 198. And the Buddha talked about speech that is well spoken. Words are well spoken speech if they consist of these 5 elements, these 5 factors. First is that it must be beneficial, it must be truthful, it must be timely, polite, and it must be said with metta. All right? Now, I want to make a comparison between this and the bar test because there are similarities. Now, in this concept of well-spoken speech, this set of 5 factors, the Buddha did not specify that they are sequential. It doesn't mean that you have to go through beneficial first, and then truthful, and then the timely, and then polite and metta, and then you say it. No, he said that if speech comprises these 5 factors, has all these 5 factors, then it is well-spoken speech. So all of them must be there. Okay, let's make a comparison between Bet and Tip Me and the bar test. So you see that there's some sort of overlap. Beneficial is found in both, but Bet and Tip Me is primarily for speech. Bar test applies to everything, even to your thoughts, your intentions, which are not expressed verbally or physically. Right? Bar test is more encompassing. You could say that Bet and Tip Me is a subset of the bar test. Truthful come under realistic, because under realistic we have the first aspect of realistic, which is factual, right? So truthful and factual are the same. Now, timely, polite, and said with metta, these can all come under appropriate. The BAR, the A of the R, appropriateness. And now we come to another aspect. Just now we were talking about applying the bar test for worldly use. Now we are talking about applying the bar test for spiritual application. Now, when you have something which doesn't pass the first step of beneficial, all right, and is harmful, and it doesn't result in the well-being for yourself and for others, then we can put it in the recycle bin. Don't simply trash it. If you don't want to walk the spiritual path, then you can just simply trash it, right? It's an unbeneficial intention, thought, feeling, perception, whatever, and then you just put it aside and you come back to the present moment, to what you are doing. But if you want to walk the spiritual path, you can make use of that as grist for the mill, like is organic fertilizer for the tree of wisdom. So whatever is not beneficial, then you go straight on to the R, recycle it by looking at it in terms of the three characteristics and or cause and effect. Three characteristics, I'm sure all of you know, that it's impermanent, it's unsatisfactory, and it's not self, because it arose by itself due to causes and conditions. So there are some causes and conditions involved. To give you a particular example, you eat something, and the moment you look at the food or you taste that food, that becomes the cause for you to have an effect. And that effect is a memory, a pleasant memory of your old days, your younger days, when you sat together with your parents in your childhood days, eating this same dish. Pleasant memories. Now that pleasant memory is an effect. The cause is because of this present circumstances that you are eating that particular food that you ate before. The condition for this thought or this memory to arise is because you had that experience. If you never had that experience, eating this dish together with your parents and having an enjoyable time, then this memory, this effect would not have arisen. So it's not because you purposely want to have that memory arose due to cause and condition. Present circumstances are causes, and conditions are past experiences. Okay? So you learn to see this. Initially, you might want to do this in an intellectual way, because it's a good way for you to get a feel of it. And then you begin to see very often that all your thoughts, feelings, perceptions are products of causes and conditions. Some present triggers, sensory triggers, triggered off a thought, a memory. You know, that memory or thought arose due to cause and condition. You did not purposely think that memory. And that memory, which is a fact due to this cause and condition, can also become the cause and condition for another effect, right? Because that is a cause for you to want to prolong the pleasure. So you try to think back about the past and re-experience the joy you had in the past. Okay, so that is a cause and condition. That is the cause. One of the other causes is that you have this desire to want to prolong that feeling of pleasure, right? And the effect is that you continue to think about it. And this becomes karmic. The first one, the first memory that arose is non-karmic because it is not your doing. It came by itself due to cause and condition. But the following thought is a proliferation that is based on desire, right? So this is for positive, pleasurable memories. On the other hand, there could be negative responses. You see somebody, it reminds you of someone who cheated you 20 years ago, and then unpleasant feelings arise, and then you recall those memories, and that feeling of resentment, of hate arises again, and you replay that whole unpleasant memory. That is also karmic, but that is also due to also desire. As I said just now, the mind can be very sadistic. It likes to replay all these bad feelings. I don't know what sort of pleasure you can get out of it. Yeah, that's why the Buddha says in the Paticca Samuppada, the law of dependent origination, feelings is a condition for tanha or craving. Doesn't matter what feelings, not only pleasurable feelings, but unpleasant feelings also can give rise to tanha or craving. So if it doesn't pass appropriate, same thing, you go straight to realistic. Use it as grist for the mill, use it as organic fertilizer for the tree of wisdom. Right? If it's not relevant also, then you go straight to the realistic. You can look at it in terms of the three characteristics and cause and condition and effect. Right? Remember, cause refers to present circumstances. The effect will be your reaction, or rather your memory, feeling, pleasant or unpleasant. And then the condition is because of the past experience or past memory or past information. So now you begin to see the importance. We come back to our first slide, or rather one of our first slides. You see, when you are able to anchor yourself to the five senses, you create this space in between thoughts and emotions. Otherwise, you are just enmeshed in continuous thinking, all enmeshed together. You cannot even separate one thought and one feeling, and you don't know how they are related. But when you try to anchor yourself to the five senses, you create this gap, this space between one thought and another thought, one feeling and another feeling, one thought and another perception. Right? So you understand your thoughts and emotions more, you begin to have the chance to be able to process that intention, that thought, that emotion, and whether you want to follow or not. And then you can make use of that as grist for the mill, as organic fertilizer for the tree of wisdom. Right? Like I said earlier, when you see that again and again and again, you see it through direct personal experience. You can actually verify for yourself. There's no one there. Yeah, all the thoughts, feelings, perceptions, they initially arise due to causes and conditions. Even the best ideas you have are also based on past experiences, information, and conditioning. No one to be proud of. No one even to blame. You don't blame yourself, you don't blame others, because we are all products of causes and conditions. So you reprogram your mind. Yeah, you reprogram your mind through personal direct experience that there's no one there, no need to get angry with yourself or angry with anybody, accept things as products of causes and conditions. However, you don't stop there. Then you become fatalistic. Yeah. There's also one other factor that's very important, and that is right effort in the Noble Eightfold Path. Right effort is the desire or effort to abandon unskillful, unwholesome mental states, prevent unwholesome mental states from arising. All right? If they arise, then you abandon them. And then also to arouse yet unarisen wholesome states like mindfulness, composure, loving kindness, forgiveness, understanding. These are all wholesome mental states. You should try to arouse them. And once they have arisen, then you should try to maintain and develop them to fulfillment. That is right effort. So it doesn't mean that you don't blame yourself, you don't blame others, and you stop there. You know that something is unskillful, you know that something is unwholesome. You don't blame yourself for it because it's due to present circumstances and past conditioning. But you know it's bad. You try not to repeat that in the future. Okay? That is part of right effort. So when you see that, all your thoughts, feelings, perceptions, whatever happens in your mind is a product of causes and conditions, you begin to understand that everybody is the same. Yeah? And you become more accepting of yourself and forgiving of others as well. Now, as I said, you shouldn't stop there. If you see or you realize that there are unwholesome things that are happening to you, then you should try to make an effort to abandon them and prevent them from happening again in the future, and then replace that with wholesome things. However, if that happens to somebody else, you know it's unwholesome, it's not so easy to tell the other person not to do that, right? It's difficult enough trying to change yourself. You think it's so easy to change others? It's not. So if you really want people to change for the better, start with yourself. Be a good example, then people will ask you, what do you do? How do you do it? Teach me lah. Right? Otherwise, you try to be a teacher when you yourself are not well established. People will lose faith in not only you, but also in what you're teaching. Okay, another point that you need to understand is that if you really want to change somebody, you have to be very, very patient, full of loving kindness and compassion. Remember the 5 factors of well-spoken speech. Okay? It doesn't mean that with all the effort you can change that person. If you're willing to try, go ahead. Yeah? No expectations. All right, so when you see all these things, you understand yourself, you watch your mind, then it's easier to let go. If you are easy to let go, you become more contented and happy. All right, so that's the efficacy, the importance of watching your mind, and it's efficacious because you become more accepting and forgiving, and you find it easier to let go, and therefore you can gain more contentment and happiness in life. Okay, so I think I will end the thought here and open it to all of you to ask questions if you have any. Any questions?
Thank you for the great teaching. We now come into the Q&A sessions. If you have any question, you can post it at the chat box. But I think we are running short of time. We need to end the sessions by 11. Now it's already almost 10:40. So there are already some questions in chat box. Bhante, you have to stop share. Then you have to stop share. Then you go to chat box for the question there.
Okay. Question. Okay, from SP.
Yes.
What is a mind according to Buddha? I once heard that mind is not an entity. It's just activities of the brain. Well, what you hear is probably what the modern neuroscientists say, because they say that mind is activities of the brain. But Buddhists will say brain activity is a product of the mind. Right? The mind is not something physical. The mind is something which is non-physical. And although there is a physical base from which the mind operates, the location of the mind cannot be really found. So what is mind? Mind is the faculty that is able to cognize, be aware of something. The ability to think, to perceive, to interpret, to conceive, these are all considered as mind. And then you have all these mental factors like feelings. Feelings is also a part of the mind, because the mind is like, you could say it's like a society where you have your exco members, and then you also have other ordinary members. Or it's like a corporation where you have your executives, and then you have the employees. Right? So the mind has got many different departments, and all of them work so that the mind can function. Just like members of the society, like all the members of an organization. So things like thinking, feelings, perception, intentions in the mind, these are all different departments of the mind. Okay, so I hope that answers the question.
For open awareness, should it be practiced during daily activities or also during formal sitting meditation?
You can do both. If you have done focused awareness practice before, you can start off, if it's familiar to you, you can start off your formal sitting by doing focused awareness, and then you try to end the sitting by doing open awareness. And then you continue that open awareness during your daily life.
The next question here from Brother S.K. Lim. Our thoughts and speech may be beneficial to one party, but not to another. How do we go from here?
Yeah, that's true. Everything is relative. So again, you have to use the basic Buddhist principle of non-harmful and beneficial. So of course, charity begins at home. It's beneficial to you, and it may not be beneficial to the person, but make sure it's not harmful to the person, right?
There is a question from FB. five khandhas only applicable to human being or all beings in the existence?
I would say that it's all beings. Yeah, simple answer. It's applicable to all beings.
Okay. The next question from Father Tan Chi Chong. How do we choose when to practice Atha anchor or bar and when to employ ACT coping mechanism?
Oh, actually, they can be combined. They can be combined in your daily life. Okay.
Okay. Next question from Brandon. What is the solution if the attachment to ankle is higher than anything else?
Okay, very simple. The direct antidote to anger is loving kindness. Because a person who is by nature, who has an angry temperament, always sees the downside of things. You would say he's a pessimist. He will always look at the faults of others, faults of situations. That is the inclination of the mind. So when you do metta meditation, you try to spread thoughts of loving kindness and acceptance and forgiveness to other people, you change that inclination of the mind, right? And then so the mind will have less tendency to look at the faults of others and able to forgive them, accept them, and wish them well. So that is a direct antidote for anger. So you start off by doing you're doing metta. Depends. You don't do it to somebody whom you dislike. All right, you do it to something or somebody that you really like or have good feelings for. It could be a dog, your pet. You have loving kindness for that, and then you try to extrapolate that same feeling of care and concern and kindness to other beings.
Another question from Brother H.N. Chia. How to stay mindful and passionate dealing with people who are blind, half blind of Dharma, which we might be a bit cruel applying the bar and end up ignoring them eventually when they are very close to us.
You have to use your discretion and use your compassion. Once there was one yogi who was she's a very serious yogi and she practices open awareness in her house. And she's a housewife. So one day the kids asked her, "Mom, are you okay?" Because she doesn't seem to be smiling, not joking with them because you are mindful all the time. So she asked me what to do. And I said, well, you don't only practice open awareness and you need to practice metta too. Right? That's why in my retreats, I always teach both open awareness or vipassana as well as metta. Right? Because you need to balance the two. It's like the yin and the yang of Buddhism. The yin is the metta and the yang is the vipassana. When you see things in terms of just atoms and molecules, then you don't have to worry or care about anybody. But you can't do that. When you look at things in that way, you are actually trying to insulate yourself from blaming yourself or blaming others. That is the point of vipassana in your daily life. But metta is different. Metta, you're talking about people, about how you relate with people. Yeah. In vipassana, you're talking about elements. There's no one there. It's only things arising and passing away due to cause and condition. No one. But in metta, you're talking about people, you and others. So you need to balance the two.
Okay. This question from Brother Fu Yin. Is the mind the same mind in all our existence?
Of course not. If it's the same mind, then that will be a soul. So from our Buddhist Theravada point of view, the mind is changing all the time. Let me ask you a question. Is your mind when you were a kid the same as the mind now when you are an adult? You can say yes and it's no, right? So it's the same thing. When you transmigrate, so to speak, from one life to another, it's the same and yet not the same. Now, that's why we have this evolution of beings. Now you keep on evolving so that the mind becomes better. It's not the same mind because the mind arises and passes away. The mind is changing according to circumstances.
Maybe we take this last question from K.S. Lim. Mind may experience different time scale as compared to actual. Is it due to imaginations or any other reason?
Yeah, what do you mean by time scales?
Father Kinsing, can you ask verbally?
Maybe sometime during the meditations, or maybe we are more mindful, we may feel like the time is actually running very long. I mean, it's just like if should only experience 5 minutes when the clock is ticking 5 minutes, but you actually feel like this is much longer or maybe much shorter. So is that imaginations or fantasy?
Yeah, because time is a mental concept. It doesn't exist in reality. It is a concept of the mind. If you're experiencing boredom or if you're experiencing pain, then it seems like eternity, right? When you got good samadhi, you're watching something and then time flies. Yeah, before you know it, it's the end of the session. So it's a mental construct.
Okay. Last question here. How to improve my mind to generate data faster? Due to slow digest data, I feel tough. I feel dull to tell others about my situations, and dull for myself to understand why am I unhappy or unwilling to do some tasks or keep round and round on one issue and hard to come out.
Sometimes it's because of one's makeup. You know, the way we were born. Sometimes we are born that way. Some people are born dull. Some people are born sharp. Some people are quick-witted and others are slow-witted. So it could also depend on the individual. And if you're thinking of quickening your mind, making it more quick-witted, but practice of mindfulness is one thing. Sometimes one is not fast enough to respond because of distractions of the mind. Because one is distracted most of the time, you're lost in thought. And so when you are confronted with a particular situation, then you have to disengage yourself from your proliferations and to attend to the present moment, the present circumstances. So that could also be a factor. One of my former students, he is a thinker. He's always lost in thought. He can't do open awareness because the moment I ask him to do open awareness, whenever he sees anything or senses anything, then immediately he will just go off into thoughts about what he sees, hears, or smells. Right? So there are some people who are just born that way. So you need to quieten the mind first. That's why I say composure is important. You need to have space in between thoughts, perceptions, feelings. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, Bhante, for the great teaching and answering all the questions. Maybe now invite Bhante to lead us for the transfer of merits.
Okay, let us now share our merits. First of all, think of all the departed relatives, friends, and teachers, and invite them to rejoice in the merits that we are about to share. And then can you please repeat after me? Idang me nyatinam hotu.
Idang me nyatinam hotu.
Sukhita hontu nyatayo.
Sukhita hontu nyatayo.
May this be for my relatives.
May this be for my relative.
Well and happy may the relatives be.
Well and happy may the relatives be.
Idam no nyatinam hotu.
Idam no nyatinam hotu.
Sukhita hontu nyatayo.
Sukhita hontu nyatayo.
May this be for our relatives.
May this be for our relatives.
Well and happy may the relatives be.
Well and happy may the relatives be.
Idam vo nyatinam hotu.
Idam vo nyatinam hotu.
Sukhita hontu nyatayo.
Sukhita hontu nyatayo.
May this be for you relatives.
May this be for you, relatives.
Well and happy may the relatives be.
Well and happy may the relatives be.
Ettavata ca amhehi.
Etawata cham amhehi.
Sampadang punya sampadang.
Sampadang punya sampadang.
Sappe satta numodantu.
Sabbe satta numodantu.
Sappa sampatti siddhya.
Sampa sampatti siddhya.
To the extent that all of us
To the extent that all of us
have accumulated a wealth of merits
have accumulated a wealth of merits.
in this may all beings rejoice.
In this may all beings rejoice.
For the attainment of all fortunes.
For the attainment of all fortunes.
And let's now honor the Buddha. Imaya.
Imaya.
Dhammanu dhammapatipatiya.
Dhammanu dhamma patipatiya.
Buddham bhagavantam pujemi.
Buddhang bhagavantam pujami.
Paramaya pujaya.
Paramaya pujaya.
By this Dhamma practice,
By this Dhamma practice,
according to the Dhamma,
according to the Dhamma,
I honor the Buddha,
I honor the Buddha,
the Blessed One,
the Blessed One,
with the highest honor.
with the highest honor.
And now let's make our aspirations. Himina punya kamena.
Imena punya kamena.
Mame bala samagamo.
Mame bala samagamo.
Satang samagamo hotu.
Satang samagamo hotu.
Yava nibbana patiya.
Yavanipana patiya.
By this meritorious action,
By this meritorious action,
may I not associate with fools.
may I not associate with fools.
With the wise may I associate.
With the wise may I associate.
Until the attainment of Nibbana.
Until the attainment of Nibbana.
Addha imaya patipadaya.
Atta imaya patipataya.
Jati jarabhyadi maranamha.
Jati jara vyati maranamha.
Parimochisami.
Parimochisami.
Indeed, by this practice,
Indeed, by this practice,
from birth, aging, sickness, and death,
from birth, aging, sickness, and death,
will I be liberated.
will I be liberated.
Idang me punyam.
Idang me punyam.
Asawakayavaham.
Asawakayawaham.
Hotu.
Hotu.
May this merit of mine
May these merits of mine
lead to the destruction of the inflows.
lead to the destructions of the inflows.
Idang me punyam.
Idang me punyam.
Nippanasa.
Nippanasa.
Pachayo Hotu.
Pachayo Hotu.
May this merit of mine
May this merits of mine
be a condition for Nibbana.
be a condition for Nibbana.
Sadhu, sadhu,
Sadhu,
sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Bhante, for
Yeah.
taking your time to share and to teach us this morning. I would like to thank everyone who participated this morning. May everyone well and happy. Sukhi Hontu, our session should end here. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu.